Okay, so I'll just do a very quick welcome. If you can just make sure that your cameras are off and your mics are off at the moment, please. If you can just pop cameras off and mics off, I'll try and mute you. Good afternoon and welcome to the West Partnership. Very first session on UNCRC. What, why and how. We are really glad that you could join us this afternoon, and I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the numbers that have come along. We are joined this afternoon by Maxine Jolly, who is, well, what she doesn't know about UNCRC isn't worth knowing. I have learned so much from this lady and I know that you will too. At the very end of the session, I will be posting a link to an evaluation. We would very much appreciate if you could fill that out. Thank you very much. Maxine, I will pass over to you.
Thanks very much, Kat. I don't know if I'm going to quite live up to expectations, but I will do my best.
Can I just jump in? Bernadette Hassan, can you maybe turn your camera off, please?
Thanks. It's when we've got such high numbers, it does interfere with the bandwidth. Okay, yeah, as Kat said, I'm Maxine Jolly from Education Scotland. There is a bit of interference. Can I just check that everybody is on mute? As Kat said, she is recording the session, so just be aware that if you do see anything, it will be recorded as well. Okay, we're going to try and keep this as interactive as possible, and I'm aware it's an online session, but nonetheless, we will provide opportunities for you to use some online interactive tools. So the what is raising awareness and understanding of the UNCRC. So that's your starting point. You have to know what it is in the first place. Then why is it important? So we'll be looking at the legislative and policy context and thinking about what that means in terms of your current practice. And then the how is, so what do you need to do? How do you support rights-based practices across schools and other organisations? Because obviously this doesn't just apply in schools, it also applies in early learning and community learning settings too. And then we really need to think about how do we take account of the UNCRC in all of our actions. If you've been to one of these sessions before, it won't be vastly different, so don't feel you have to stay unless you want a refresh. Okay. Now, I did have an evaluation, but I think, Kat, you've said you've got your own, so we won't get you to double dose as long as Kat forwards it to me, that's fine. So first bit is the what are rights. So just to get you started, there's a QR code there. You can either scan the QR code or Kat can put a link into the chat to the link that you see here, or you can go to menti.com and put in this code. So I'll just give them a second or two for you to scan, if that's your preferred method, and then I'll go in and share the actual Menti. You able to get that into the chat, Kat? If not, I can hopefully grab it myself. My mouse is playing up today, which doesn't help.
Sorry, I put my mic off, I've got it.
You've got it, okay, yeah, my mouse is being a pest. Okay, I'll just come out of the presentation and launch the Menti. So this is a word cloud. This version of Menti is free, so it's a nice one to use when you're launching the UNCRC with parents, learners, community, to get a starting point of what people think. And when you've got big numbers like we have here, it's really powerful.
Can I just ask everyone to turn cameras and mics off? Just this session is being recorded.
You've got some.
I've got Mrs. Divine. I can't see the surname. Can you turn your camera off, please?
Sure.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Sorry, I'm coming in late.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's just because it's been recorded and there's a large number of people on the call. Thanks.
As I said, this version of Menti is a free one and a great way of, and you can use it very easily with children and young people as well. Obviously P4 upwards probably would be able to cope with clicking on the link and adding in some words.
What was the code for that Menti, Maxine? Oh, it's there 365696. I'll put 7.
Okay, I'll leave that. You can continue to add to it. I can see there's about quite a few people now being in. 46 there we've got at the bottom, which is always useful to be able to see how many are participating. Okay, but you can continue to add to that, but we see in the middle there we've got the most used words around valued, respect, voice, safe, etc. So I'll stop sharing that and just go back into the presentation. Okay. So like I said, nice easy one to do with a range of people at the start of your journey. Oh, we can see you now, Kat. Okay, so just some basic background information. In terms of the articles, there are 54. First 42 are the ones we usually refer to. They're the provisions. The others are around implementation and final clauses. So they're not something that you would really look at in any depth unless you're getting really into this sort of legal side of things. The important points to remember are that the UNCRC is universal. It applies to all children, regardless of race, religion, abilities, family circumstances. They just have them from birth to 18, regardless. It is unconditional. All children everywhere in the world are entitled to rights. They do not have to be earned, and they're not dependent on responsibilities. Children have them regardless. Human rights are inalienable. They cannot be given or taken away. They are inherent. They are permanent and cannot be separated from the individual. And finally, they are indivisible. So rights are completely interdependent and depend on each other for their effectiveness. So, for example, children have the right to relax and play, and they also have the right of free assembly. And ideally, they need to exercise both of these rights for either one to work properly. So I try to remember these as the 2 U's, think of 2 little sheep, and 3 I's, because they are not easy words to remember. So it's important that we keep those in mind when we're talking about children's rights. By indivisible, it doesn't mean you can't have a right of the week or a right of the month and focus on things that might be particularly relevant to your children or your community, but it's just remembering that they exist within that context of the whole convention. Okay, so
Maxine, are we able to share the slideshow after this?
I will convert it to a PDF and send it on, yeah, because it's far too big to send as an actual presentation. So there are 3 domains of themes. So all of the articles are organised under these 3 domains or themes. Provision, which is provision of services such as education, housing, healthcare. It refers to the sharing and distribution of resources, and this includes access to play facilities, leisure and arts. Protection is self-explanatory. It's about making sure children and young people are protected from things such as abuse or from dangerous drugs. And then participation is around providing the opportunities to make sure that children's views are sought, heard, and actively influence decisions or outcomes. So it's around that right to do things, express yourself, and have an effective voice. Sometimes we talk about a 4th P, which is promotion, and this links to Article 42. So in other words, raising awareness of the UNCRC. So Kat, at the beginning of that document I sent you, there's a link to a summary of the UNCRC, just in case anybody hasn't got one handy. And we'll go to a Padlet activity. Again, this isn't about getting things right or wrong. It's about becoming more familiar with the articles. So once you've got access to the summary of the UNCRC, I will go in to show you what the Padlet looks like, so you know how it works. I know I'm having terrible problems with my mouse today. Okay, so that's a link to the summary. And then there'll be the link to the Padlet coming in. And while that Kat's putting that in, I'll just go to the Padlet itself and show you what that looks like and what to do. Browser. Bobby. I'm just going to have to stop presenting for a second, sorry. Okay, so here's the Padlet. So if you've not used one before, all you would do is click on the plus and add something in. So for example, I know that Article 28, which is education, is a provision right. So I just type in Article 28 and publish, and there it pops up underneath there. So as I said, this isn't about getting things right or wrong. It's about familiarising yourself with some of the articles. And again, we're not going to spend ages on this, but it's a good activity for you to use back in your establishments with your parents, your colleagues, your learners. You don't have to do it on Padlet. You can use post-it notes on flip chart paper and move around the room and have conversations. Like I said, the main point is that familiarisation with the articles. So hopefully everybody's able to get in there, and that this isn't one of the websites that's blocked. Sometimes they are. But it is a really useful activity to do to encourage people to engage with what's actually in there, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the articles of the UNCRC say. I'm just going to actually pop back in quickly to the presentation, because there is also a QR code which might be useful for some of you as well. If you find that easy to use. Let's jump back to the Padlet. So I've got lots of things coming through there, and you will find sometimes that the same article will appear in different columns, and that's just with the way it's interpreted. So, for example, Article 28, the right to education, is a provision article, but you would assume that by being in school or receiving an education, children are therefore able to participate, and that they'd also be protected. So you might sometimes find people interpreting in those different ways. Okay, I'm not going to spend any longer on that, but you can continue to add to it if you wish. And I'll just jump back into the presentation. Okay. The other way you can look at rights, or sort them if you want to, but we're not going to do that now, but is through the general principles or underpinning rights. Nobody expects anybody to remember all 42 rights. However, these are the 4 you do need to have in your mind. Even if you can't remember the numbers, it's the principles that they're about that are important. So Article 2 covers that principle of universality, so it's without discrimination applying to everyone. Article 3 is around the best interests of the child, and that has to come first before any other consideration in all actions concerning children. It can be a really useful one to refer to, where rights can sometimes appear to be in conflict. For example, children have the right to privacy, but if they're accessing inappropriate online content or at risk of online grooming, then it's appropriate to put some restrictions on that privacy because that's in their best interests. We could go into a whole debate about who decides what is in their best interests, and that obviously depends on the age of the child and their abilities and so on. But generally speaking, that's a useful one to refer back to. Article 6 is around survival and development, and it recognises that every child has the inherent right to life, and that states must ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of the child. So obviously, where yourselves are concerned, education is absolutely crucial to that development aspect of that article. And then Article 12 is around the right to be heard. And this is often seen as a gateway right, because without Article 12, it's very difficult for children and young people to exercise their other rights. And participation, therefore, is often the first step to raising awareness of rights. But please remember that effective participation is only one aspect of a rights-based approach. It is not the totality of it. So some articles can be underpinned by all 4 of these general principles. So, for example, Article 9 says you should not be separated from your parents unless it's for your own good. Obviously, this applies to all children, so without discrimination. You would only be removing a child from their parents if it was in the best interest of the child. You would be doing it because it's to ensure their survival and development, and you would sincerely hope that the views of the child were taken into consideration during any such action. So some of the articles will be underpinned by maybe one of the general principles, some might be underpinned by 2, 3, or even all of them. Okay, we're going to do another quick Menti activity. This is a really important one to do, and you can do this yourselves, and I'll explain it to you once we get into it. Kat will put the link into the chat, or you can scan the QR code. I will read out a number of statements, and you have to vote from whether you strongly agree through to strongly disagree. Just read the question carefully before, sorry, the statement carefully before you do vote, because you can't change your mind after you've done it. Traditionally, this used to be done in a room with people moving from one side of the room to the other according to their views. By doing it on Menti, you make it totally anonymous, so people don't follow the crowd. They can say what they genuinely think, and you get a much better understanding of people's views. This version of Menti is not free, but you can do it just as easily on a Jamboard. Okay, I will just wait for Kat to get the link in the chat, and hopefully you've all had a chance to scan the QR code if that's your preferred way of doing it. And then I will go to the Menti and launch that. Okay. And this is where we see the 5 million tabs that I've got open. What's it coming on now? It's taking its time. It's a bit rusty. It hasn't been used much over the summer. I think that might be what it is. It's not good. I'll try refreshing the page. There we go. Okay, so that first statement, children and young people should be taught about their rights, should be taught about their responsibilities when learning about their rights. So again, vote from whether you strongly agree through to strongly disagree. Down at the bottom right here, I can see how many people have voted, so I'll know when roughly the right number of people have been in, and I can move on to the next statement. If you are using this version of Menti and you're not familiar with it, you move the slides on through this box at the bottom here, which you don't see unless you move your mouse over it. So I can see we've got 12 people in so far. Not everybody wants to participate, and that's absolutely fine. Some people prefer to just to watch and listen, and that's absolutely acceptable. Okay, 20 people voted, 22 so far. Okay, I'm not going to give much of a commentary because I don't want to influence people's choices. Okay, I'll move on to the next statement because I don't think there's too many people coming in now. So that's going to get the sun out of the screen. Okay, so the next statement, children and young people already know enough about their rights. Yeah, a few more people in now, I think. All right, so the next statement. Promoting children's rights endangers the rights of the adults looking after the children. Now, as I said, if you're doing this kind of activity, you can amend the questions, you can develop questions or statements that are suited to your own particular context, and you could use a Jamboard or another interactive tool that allows that anonymity. Okay. The next one. Giving children and young people a voice can make their behaviour more challenging for adults sometimes. Okay, and that's roughly the right numbers. And children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds should be given greater support to realise their rights. I think there's one more after this. Okay, and last one, some people have beat me to it. Children and young people are or should be active partners in their education rather than service users. Now, having said that you want this to be anonymous as far as possible, you could still arrange for small groups to discuss the statements and then go and vote individually based on those discussions, because it can be quite good to have that challenge as well. Depends on how you want to do it. Okay. Right, I'm going to go back to the first statement and just take you through some of the thoughts around that. Okay, this is the one around rights and responsibilities. And usually we do get the strongly agrees and agrees as being the most common answer. You may remember in a couple of slides back, I mentioned that rights were unconditional and therefore not dependent upon responsibilities. And that is absolutely the case. And it's very clear in the UNCRC and all of the other human rights treaties that the rights are unconditional and don't have to be earned. So that means we cannot actually link rights and responsibilities. That doesn't mean to say that we don't want children to learn to be responsible. It's just about keeping the two things separate. So, for example, how can you ask a baby to be responsible, or a child with significant complex needs? And what does responsibility look like? My idea and Kat's idea might be very different, so it's quite subjective. But the other problem, the main problem, is that if children start to think that by behaving in a way that an adult disapproves of, that their rights can be removed, they're then becoming vulnerable. They're at risk, potentially at risk of safeguarding issues. So we need to make sure that we keep the two things completely separate. So rather than being opposite sides of the same coin, view them as two separate coins. So you can't really say you have the right to play there before you have the responsibility to, or you have the right to fresh water there before you have the responsibility to, because that is actually not the case. And the UNCRC is very clear on that, as is the Children's Commissioner's Office, and obviously this will become legislation as well. And I realise for many people that can be quite a challenge, because that's something, if you're younger teachers, may well have been taught that themselves at school. The E's and O's in the Curriculum for Excellence, some of them do explicitly link rights and responsibilities. That will change, and we are aware of the problem, but obviously you can't write a curriculum overnight. So just to be aware of this fact. And of course, the curriculum for excellence is guidance, whereas this will be legislation, and I'll talk about legislation more further on. Okay, children and young people already know enough about their rights. We tend to get the disagrees and strongly disagrees. In some schools, you might find that children and young people do know a lot, but generally across society, there's a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions. Children might pick up messages on social media that are not accurate. So that's why us as educators need to make sure that they're getting the correct information. Okay, endangering the rights of adults looking after the children. Again, we usually have the disagrees and strongly disagrees, although as we've got here, we occasionally have a few people who agree with that statement. And that can come again from adults not really understanding what's in the UNCRC, or because of an experience they might have had where a child has said, you can't do that because I have the right to. And that's sometimes because the child doesn't know what their rights are either. So it's about making sure that everybody's rights are all upheld and respected. And it's always a good idea to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights alongside the UNCRC, obviously not with younger children, but that adults within the establishment can still look at the two conventions together, and that can be very reassuring for anybody who's a bit apprehensive or worried about incorporation of the UNCRC. The making behaviour more challenging for adults sometimes. It really depends on how you interpret the word challenging, and it can mean disruptive, or it can mean that a child or young person is willing and able to ask an adult a question or make a suggestion, or disagree with them in obviously a respectful way, as you would hope the adult would disagree with a child in a respectful way also. From my experience, I've not come across a situation where learning about your rights or being able to express your views and opinions would have a negative impact on behaviour. The opposite tends to be the case, and there's plenty of research around that. But it will make children and young people more willing to share their views and opinions and to hold adults to account. Children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds being given greater support to realise their rights. Usually, again, they agrees, as we can see here. However, it shouldn't be assumed some children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds actually might have a very good support, you know, in their families or in their communities from their friends, and they maybe don't need extra support. But the important things that we check and make sure that they are able to fully access their rights. And again, it depends on how you what is a disadvantaged background as well. There's different ways you can interpret that. Children and young people should be active partners in their education rather than service users. And as we've got here, we nearly always get the strongly agrees and agrees. We know that children learn better when they're engaged and they understand what their learning is for and the relevance of it. However, just so you're prepared, you will sometimes still get some people who strongly disagree with that statement and believe that children and young people come into school to sit and listen to the teacher, impart their knowledge and go away again. So basically be very passive in their learning. Okay, I'm going to come out of that Menti now, but I can't see the chat because of the sun, believe it or not. Move that curtain across the people. Is there anything in the chat so far that anything anybody wants to ask? I can pause at this point while I go back into my presentation.
Nothing so far that I can see. If you do have any questions, please feel free to just put them in the chat.
Thanks.
Or if you want to raise your hand, then you can do.
Okay. There's a lot to think about through this session, so it might be that you want to go away and reflect. Now, I'm not actually going to do this activity, but it's just something that you might want to do back in your establishments, and I'll just show you what it looks like. Again, it's on a Padlet, but you could equally do it in other ways, face-to-face and in groups and having chats. And it's about comparing what the wants and needs of adults are and what the wants and needs of children are. So just a little body there. So what I'll do is I will show you what the Padlet looks like so you can get a better understanding of what I'm speaking about. I did have it loaded up earlier, have I lost it? There it is. Okay, so you can see just as before with the Padlet, you click on the plus and add in what does an adult want, what does an adult need, what does a child want, what does a child need. And it's a great one to do with children and adults together because it can be really quite entertaining in some ways because you'll see there are things that come across all 4 columns. It's also a great way of finding out if anybody's had a good day or not. So it's a good one to do. And like I said, I'm not going to do it now. You could equally, as I've said, do post-it notes on flip chart paper or even do it in more creative ways, drawing little cartoons, animations, if you want to spend time on it in that way. So just a nice one to try, but we're not going to do it just now because I don't want to spend ages on it. But I'll go back into the presentation. As I said, I'm not going to do that. So what is a right? Does anybody want to pop it into the chat how they would define a right without Googling it? Nobody's been brave enough.
There we go. Well done,
Entitlement.
Leanne.
Good, good. Okay. Okay, brilliant.
Well done, Miss Ross. Takes courage to do that.
I know it does, doesn't it? You're both spot on, absolutely. But this is a good one to start unpacking again with staff, the difference between wants, needs and rights, and also with children, and even very young children can grasp that difference between wants and needs. So that I like that too, with something you're entitled to without circumstance. So a want is a desire for something. We all know what that is. You don't necessarily need it, but you'd like to have it. So you might, for children, it might be one to have expensive toys to play with or a certain pair of trainers. So that's a want. The need is an aspiration. It can be quite legitimate, but is not necessarily associated with an obligation to cater for it. Satisfaction of a need cannot be enforced, and quite often a need may come about if there is a lack of something. And for example, during lockdown, during COVID, a lot of people were feeling isolated and lonely and needed company, but that couldn't be provided. A right is a moral or legal entitlement, as we said there, to have or do something. It's a more positive thing than a want or a need. But one of the ways that really helps people to understand the difference is that the rights are the same for everybody. Wants and needs are not the same for everybody. They're not even the same for the same person on the same day. What you might want or need early in the morning might be different as the day progresses. So that really can help to enshrine the difference between the 3 things. And the other important point about rights is they are essentially about allowing a person to live with human dignity, so that they're there to uphold the dignity of the individual. So just 3 simple definitions. As you see, we've got the term entitlement here, entitled here. It doesn't mention entitlement over here, but it's implicit in the actual definition. They're all absolutely fine to use as definitions. We can see the term dignity here again. So you can share all of these. None of them are right or wrong. It depends on who you're sharing them with. I would say for upper primary, the Oxford Online Dictionary definition would be fine. For your older students, perhaps one of the others. And for your very young children, you'd be talking just about rights are the things you have to make sure that you are happy, safe, and enjoying your home, your community, your school. So what is the UNCRC? It says here what it is. It is that right to survival. It is that right to civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. It is legally binding in international law. It is not legally binding yet in domestic law. Every country in the world, apart from the United States, has ratified the UNCRC. That doesn't mean it's being delivered in every country in the world. I'm sure you'll know that even in the UK and Scotland, in probably every community, there'll be occasions when children's rights are infringed. But the aspiration and the will is there. The reason why the United States has not ratified the UNCRC there are twofold. One is that they believe it undermines the rights of parents, which is absolutely not the case. There are many articles around family and parental rights and how they are important. The other reason is because in some states they still have the death penalty for young people under the age of 18, which is a slight infringement of rights, to put it mildly. And I don't know if any of you've seen it, but very recently on, I think, was it on Twitter? I think it was on Twitter. There is a school in Missouri in the States that is bringing back corporal punishment. So, you know, when other countries, developing countries, are trying to move away from that and raise awareness of why it's not appropriate, we've got one of the biggest powers in the world going in the opposite direction, which is a concern. Okay, so the second part of the presentation, why do rights matter? So in this bit, we're going to be looking more at policy and legislation, which may sound a bit dry, but I'll try not to bore you too much. So just quick summary where we are with the legal situation. The bill was passed on the 16th of March, so almost 18 months ago now, and opposed in Parliament. So this was to incorporate the UNCRC into Scots law. It had cross-party support, no abstentions, and commencement was meant to take place on the 1st of November, but the bill was challenged by the Westminster government as parts of the bill were believed to be out with the powers of a devolved government. This was upheld by the Supreme Court. The Scottish Government did commit to continuing with some form of incorporation and has made a pledge to further the human rights of children in Scotland. There is now a new bill being consulted on, and the amendments will go back to Parliament probably round about November, December time this year, although the timescales have not been confirmed, and then getting royal assent not long after that. To the layperson, the bill doesn't look particularly any different. It's still very much about public bodies will be accountable for upholding children's rights. And if they don't, then the children and or their representatives can take that public body to the courts. Please don't worry, this is not about individual members of staff being prosecuted. It is the public body. So this is about your, you know, for most of you, it'll be the local authority who will be held accountable. But you would expect any concerns to be addressed way before that. So, you know, children's rights complaints mechanisms, you know, all of those sort of things that should be in place to address this at source rather than it escalating to a legal situation, because I don't think anybody would want to go down that road. However, that said, there is a lot of policy guidance and self-evaluation already in existence around children's rights and participation across all sectors of education. We have over here, we've got the Promise, the Independent Care Review, which talks very much about children's rights and making sure that those are taken into account around decisions that impact on children and their families, and that children and young people have a say in those decisions. The Support for Learning review by Angela Morgan says exactly the same thing. So those are very much upholding that. Those of you who are from early years backgrounds will be very familiar with Realising the Ambition. Again, Realising the Ambition, it's very much places a child-based approach at the heart of our early learning and childcare. And early years practitioners on the whole tend to be very good at taking forward rights-based approaches because they plan around the needs of the child. How good is our community learning and development? And I think we do have some CLD colleagues in the call today as well. That the new 4th edition, which is online, even if you're not from a CLD background, I would suggest you look at it because the evaluative questions in it are very strong around children's rights, and it's a really useful document. The Achieving Excellence and Equity, the new National Improvement Framework, has a new priority, which states that placing the human rights and needs of every child and young person at the centre of education. And it also includes early learning now, and not CLD yet, but hopefully that will happen. So all of you who work in either early learning or schools have a need to make sure you deliver on that priority, and the local authorities need to report on that. Those of you who are aware of the education reform agenda, putting learners at the centre, Professor Muir's report very much emphasises the need to put Article 29 at the centre of education and to make sure we listen to learners and what learners think should happen to the future of education. How good is our school? We're all familiar with that. This is the child-friendly version, which is very much tied into Higgies 4, for those of you who are school-based. GTC The standards were refreshed a year ago and very much reference children's rights, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And then, of course, we've got the learner participation in educational settings 3 to 18 document, which not many people know about. Very good online resource. So those are just a few of the things which really back up the UNCRC, and I'll come back to GAFIC in a minute. So in terms of how does it fit, we've got our 4 capacities, and it very much sits within that whole idea of successful learners and effective contributors. In fact, all of the capacities are relevant. The 4 contexts on the left-hand side there, interdisciplinary learning lends itself so well to a rights-based approach because it is learner-led and often learner-instigated. So it's much, much more than just your curriculum areas and subjects. UNCRC can go across the totality of a child's experiences in school. And then on the right-hand side there, did I say right before? Anyway, I'm sure you followed what I'm saying. The learning, teaching and assessment. These are the 4 arenas for participation down here from that learner participation 3 to 18 resource. So it's not just about your decision-making groups, it's about how do you involve children, young people in decision-making around learning, teaching and assessment, both at classroom and whole school level. What opportunities are there for personal or wider achievement? And that's often where community learning can come into work as well and support. What opportunity are there for decision-making groups? So not just pupil councils, but other groups as well. And then how are children and young people enabled to participate in the wider community? I mentioned briefly before the GTC standards. There are many references to rights participation UNCRC throughout the refreshed standards. These are just some that I've taken from the personal commitment to being a teacher in Scotland. So this is very linked to the social justice area of the standards. So I'll just let you read those and you can see and start to reflect on what does this look like in practice. So if anybody wants to pop in the chat, what would they expect to see if they went into a school or a classroom where just even these 3 extracts from the standards were in place? What would that look like? So I don't know if anybody wants to come in there because I'm talking too much. Anybody want to pop anything in the chat? People will put something in a minute. Okay, of course, our schools are not just populated by teachers, and education doesn't just happen in schools, it also happens in early learning settings in the community. So we'll look at some of that as well. So SSC, most of your early learning practitioners will be SSC registered. And we can see here about support the rights of people who use services. Also remember, social work colleagues that you work with will also be SSC registered too. So it gives you a common language. And we've got something in the chat about class charters in each class, and class charters are great. You know, if they're used and influence what happens in the classroom, really useful and helpful because they're co-designed. And pupil voice clear in topic lessons and so on. Again, we've got this reference to dignity, to promoting diversity and respect. So you can see that there are common issues going through. When we look at our CLD competency wheel, again, we can see these references to empowerment, about ensuring we maintain positive relationships. So again, we can see that there's that commonality. Okay, and then these are the national operational standards for youth work. These are UK-wide. I have to stress they're not as specific just to Scotland. But again, you getting the message that it's about voice, influence, young people being able to make decisions within their local communities and engage in those local communities as well. And the school is part of the local community. I'll just let you read that. And I love that bit around address life's challenges critically and creatively. I think that's such an important point, and that's what we want our young people to be able to do. And that goes back to the agree-disagree activity around being able to challenge, because our children, young people need to grow up to be able to respectfully challenge and ask questions, otherwise they're not going to be able to be critical and creative. This is just an example, Stirling Social Justice Ambassadors, of a really good project that worked between the school and the community to develop this toolkit, digital interactive toolkit. So you can see how you can work together, and children and young people will develop skills by working across different sectors, working with other organisations, and through that realising their rights. Right, the effect came from the UNCRC, not the other way around. It's important to understand that. This document is a very useful one. I'll try and pop the link in the chat when I get an opportunity. But it provides you with a means to map the UNCRC articles into the wellbeing indicators, so your colleagues can see the connection between the wellbeing indicators and the UNCRC, and that they're not separate things. You can also do it with upper primary onwards, because most of our primary school children and secondary school aged children will be aware of the wellbeing indicators. So what is a rights-based approach? This is a definition that comes from an organisation called Together Scotland, who are an alliance of Scottish charities that work together to take forward children's rights. This came from their annual State of Children's Rights report, and I really like this definition. It makes it very clear that what we're talking about is putting children's rights at the heart of planning and service delivery, and integrating children and young people's rights into every aspect of decision making, policy and practice. What I find particularly helpful about it is that it's not education specific. So you can use this definition with all of your partners that you work with, and your parents as well. So for that reason, I think it can be a really helpful reference point. Okay, hopefully everybody's had a chance to read that, and I'm not going too quickly. Okay, I've got a couple of quotes now from the preamble. All human rights conventions have a preamble before they go into the articles. And I've just taken a couple of quotes out of the UNCRC one, because sometimes we can get a bit fixated on the articles and we'll have them posted up all around the school or the setting, and we don't always think about what the articles are for. So the preamble is really setting the scene about what the articles are for. So this one here is around making sure that that child grows up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. Now, there isn't an article that says you have the right to love, because obviously that's an emotion and that can't be enforced. But what the articles do is set the scene so that it is more likely that a child will be able to grow up in that atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. And again, we've got that reference to developing personality. This is also a really nice quote to use with parents, because if they are anxious, perhaps, that the UNCRC is undermining the rights of parents or families, this can be very, very reassuring for them. The second quote that I've lifted, and there could be many more I could have used, is this one, and it's again emphasising that inherent dignity and again the inalienability of rights. So we can see that it's that the real positive message is coming through from the preamble. So I'll give you a second or two to read that one as well. Goals of education then, and this doesn't just mean schools, this means education in the broader sense. Article 28 is the right to an education. Don't think anybody would argue with that, it's a basic right. This must respect children's dignity, and what they're talking about specifically is discipline in schools should uphold the dignity of the individual. So there shouldn't be any practice that humiliates, embarrasses, points the finger at children. And that can be a bit of a challenge for some schools where they've got embedded approaches that perhaps do exactly that. So it's about going back and thinking, if I was standing in the shoes of that child, would I feel embarrassed, humiliated, And you know, when children are embarrassed, or anybody is embarrassed or humiliated, that the way they react can be to add another challenge to the situation. 29, as I mentioned before, must develop every child's personality, talents and abilities to the full. And General Comment 1 of the UNCRC really expands on that in great detail and articulates so well with it, the aims of curriculum for excellence, which is why Professor Muir specified that Article 29 should sit at the heart of the curriculum. And then 31, relax, play and take part in a wide range of cultural and artistic activities. This can be particularly relevant for what used to be called extracurricular, so things that happen after school, at lunchtime, youth clubs, whatever it might be. The important point here is to make sure that no learner is excluded from something they want to take part in. So if it's an after-school activity and you've got a care-experienced young person who's perhaps using school transport because of where their placement is, how are they able to participate in after-school activities if they want to? So it's just about thinking through those children who perhaps are in different circumstances and making sure they're able to participate. All children with additional support needs should be supported to participate in any activities that they want to take part in. Okay, a very quick Menti now. So we've talked about what a rights-based approach is in that definition from together. We've looked at the goals of education. So what do you think the benefits of a rights-based approach might be? So again, you can use the QR code and Kat will put the link into the chat. And again, we'll get another word cloud. And this is a good thing to do if you're taking other people through some of these messages. You've got the original word cloud at the beginning, and then you come back to this one further on once you've done a bit more explanation and exploration with them.
Someone's asking if they can still order a poster pack of rights, Maxine.
Is this from UNICEF?
I think it usually is, isn't it?
Yeah, you can. You should probably. I don't know. You need to go onto their website and check.
Yes. Yeah, UNICEF. Yeah, try their website.
Yeah, I'll just come out of here and go and put in that Menti.
That's the link in the chat now. Menti.
Thanks. That's not the right one. Oh, I think I've just gone and closed it instead of. I have. Right, hang on. I'll just have to put it in again. Bear with me. Just stop sharing for a moment.
Right, I'll log in too. If anyone's got any questions, then feel free. Also, if you're tweeting about the event, I'll put in all of our Twitter tags as well if you want to tag anybody.
It only took me 2 seconds to get it back. I just accidentally closed it when I was trying to present it.
Right, okay, mine easy peasy. I can't remember Maxine's. I shall just look Maxine up. It's good to get the word out there that there's lots of professional learning running.
Okay, here we go again. Here is the Menti that you're working on just now.
Oh, they're on it already.
Yep. Great things. And I can see a shift from the first one. We didn't have dignity in the middle there, and now it's very much there. And empowerment is there. We've got more things around relationships, inclusion. So you can see how people's thinking has moved from the first word cloud onto this one. If it's helpful for you, Kat, I can export these to PDFs and send them to you afterwards. Again, that's another thing you can do with Menti and also with Padlets as well. You can export them and you could enlarge them and you could use them as in displays and things as well within your settings. Okay, some great ones coming through. Okay. Great. Got nature there as well. Right, okay. You can continue to add to that while I'm talking. It's just because I stopped sharing that screen, you can still add in your words. Let's go back into the presentation, but please continue to add in. So these are some feedback that we've had from previous sessions, but also from research, mostly by the University of Stirling, about the benefits of rights-based approaches and effective learner participation. So if you do need a selling point, and sometimes we do, there are some very useful ones in here around improved relationships, about that improved ethos, about addressing the attainment gap, and attainment is a rights-based issue because we know that it is children that live in poverty are more likely to have lower levels of attainment. But things like emotional empathy, I think, are really important as well. So all of these are really useful things to be able to highlight with your colleagues. Okay. So it'd be best probably if we just use the chat for this. We've talked about the positive, the benefits of children's rights and rights-based approaches. Can you think of any examples? And it doesn't have to be your current school, it could be any school or your local community, your early learning setting, where children's rights may still be infringed in some way. So if anybody's brave enough to put into the chat, that'd be fine. Nobody's going to be going telling tales. It could be your own kid's school, for example. So one of the ones, just to get you while you're thinking, it could be there are a lot of issues come through about toilets. Okay, for example, children not being allowed to go to the toilet, toilets being locked, them having to ask permission. But a really good example that I can share very recently was, and it wasn't a West Partnership school, where a boy went into a classroom at the start of the lesson in secondary school, he was S2, very start, and asked to go to the toilet. Teacher said, yeah, no problem, be quick, because everybody else is still sitting down and I haven't started yet. Literally 10 seconds later, she gets a phone call from a principal teacher on the floor above to say, let's call him Joe. Joe's just gone to the toilet on this floor. He's already been to the toilet this morning. That's a level 2 discipline. So Joe comes back down very quickly into the classroom, not been more than 2 or 3 minutes, is immediately told you've got a level 2 discipline. And of course, not surprising, he just walks out. The worst thing about it is the reason he'd gone to the toilets on the floor above was the ones on his floor were locked. And then there was lots of toing and froing around all of that. So that is a kind of example that we come across frequently. So we've got unable to take part in school plays after school club because of parental choice. And yes, that is going to be an interesting one when we have incorporation, because the rights of the child may well become more, I'm trying to think of the right word, I don't want to say more important, but may take precedence over the rights of the parent, depending on the age of the child. Yep, golden time. Yes, Carrie. That is sometimes the same children all the time, not accessing golden time, and sometimes golden time can involve in primary schools charts on walls where children's names get moved up and down, and it's very public. Yep, specific dietary requirements. There'll be lots when you go and look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, because sometimes it's not that this is being done deliberately, it's just this is the institution of the school and or the setting, and nobody's really thought about it through a child's rights lens. We're not going to go into how this right might be restored, because that's a conversation for you to have in your own settings and to think about. Sorry about my dogs. Okay, again, you could have done this on a Menti if you want to make it anonymous. Okay, so on to the last part. You'll be pleased to know, how do we realise rights? So these are some examples. There'll be loads of things doing already, and it's worthwhile sitting down with an audit and thinking about what do we already do that meets these requirements. So if you use genuine restorative approaches, and I do mean genuine, it's not just that the child has to apologise and that's the end of it, but genuine restorative, where everybody has a conversation about what happened, and what needs to happen next, and how relationships can be repaired. Person-centred planning, so that includes things like individualised education plans, care plans, all of these sort of things that you might have, and they're called different things in different authorities. So I've just called it person-centred planning. Genuine interdisciplinary learning, that's learner-led and involve the local community context. Things such as the circle resource around embedding equity and inclusion, the compassionate and connected classrooms, if you're not familiar with it, is a resource for, it's meant to be upper primary, but I would say you could also use it P5 to S2, very much linked into rights, and it's about developing empathy and nurturing approaches. So just again, if there's anything you're using already in your schools or settings that you want to pop into the chat, that would be really helpful.
And I'll give you a heads up, there is a 4-week block on that circle resource coming. 4 weeks for primary and 4 weeks for secondary. Looking at it'll be in January. I think February, March next year. So keep your eyes out for that one if you're not using it already.
Okay, that's a question. Care Commission guidelines that toilets attached to the playroom should be closed. I assume by closed you mean that you can't see into them, not that you can't use them, which makes it difficult for some children. I mean, I don't know the exact context, but there is, I suppose that's that thing around dignity. But I think if you've got some children that can't access the toilet because of that situation, then is there some way that I would get back to personally, I would contact the Care Commission and ask them that question. Because if they don't hear back from people, they don't know that it is causing an issue for some children. Okay, I'm not going to play the film. So as I mentioned before about toilets, so these are some ITE students from secondary schools from a particular ITE setting, so it weren't all from the same school. I'm not picking on secondary schools, by the way, it's just I happen to be engaging with this group of ITE students. So that's how I managed to gather these stories. I'm sure I could also gather stories from various other settings as well. So you can see there some examples. I mentioned toilets already, kids standing outside the classroom for whole periods as a form of punishment. And not only is that an impact on their dignity, there's also the fact they're not accessing their education during that time. And then Josh there at the end with his hood up, not disrupting, then he's shouted at to take his hood down. He then doesn't engage for the rest of the day. And what we haven't addressed there is why Josh had his hood up and why he was feeling that he needed to hide. So that could have been dealt with a lot better. And then just another toilet one. And for me, one of the ones that is disturbing is that last one about people being screamed at to such an extent that if they'd witnessed that between a parent and a young person, they would have actually reported that as a safeguarding concern. And one of the things you can do with these examples, and they're not scenarios, they are actually real examples, is you can use these and talk to your colleagues about, well, how could that have been dealt with differently? And what could you have done before to avoid that situation? How could you have done things differently during that situation? What needs to be done afterwards to put it right? The teacher that's screaming, is that because that's a cultural norm in that school? Or is it because that teacher's in a very difficult, stressed situation that needs to be supported? I don't know the full context, but these are the things that need to be thought about. You can make up your own scenarios, or you can actually use a real situation that you've come across to unpick if you want to. It depends how brave your colleagues are in terms of sharing something. So one of the things we like to round off with is an imagine if. Now, these are provocations, and I need to make that clear. Nobody's saying that all of these things happen all the time in all schools. I know they don't, but I would say most of them happen in most schools most of the time. The one that I like to really highlight here is bells. We know that during COVID, a lot of bells got switched off because of staggered breaks, staggered starts, staggered finishes, and the bells were just ringing constantly, and it was driving everyone nuts. So a lot of schools switched them off, and they've realised they don't actually need them. But even pre-COVID, I know of some schools who didn't use who turned their bells off because it was causing stress and anxiety to particularly learners with autism, and they found that the whole school became so much calmer. Children still got from one lesson to the next pretty much on time, just maybe a few seconds difference, but there wasn't that absolute situation where you've got in a big secondary school or a big primary school, hundreds of children all coming out of their classrooms at exactly the same time. And, you know, that can be quite difficult. So it really helped to calm down a lot of schools, and it also gave the teachers more time if they needed 30 seconds to round off a lesson to be able to do that without it becoming an issue. So that is something that's been in place for 150 years, was the bells, and it was only there because originally the school bell was used to train children in Victorian schools to go into Victorian factories where they had that very regimented kind of day, and nobody ever thought to think, do we still need it? So I'm not saying that these things on the left-hand side are right or wrong. It's just, do we still need them? Do we still have to do it in that way? Is there a better way of doing it? And perhaps we do still need them, and that's okay. But look at it through the right lens of children's rights. Are we doing this because it upholds the rights of children, or are we doing it because it suits the establishment, the institution? And then on the right-hand side, these are a bit more provocative as well. But it's about standing in the shoes of the child and thinking about particularly those punitive methods that some establishments have around writing names on boards, and that still does happen. I was in a school not long ago where it was an in-service day and there was all of these kids' names written on the board, but there was no children there. And I said, what are these names? I said, oh, those are the kids that have been sent out, but they've forgotten to wipe them off. So every cleaner in that community who'd gone into the school would have seen exactly which kid had been sent out of class that day. Standing in the corridor, yes, for a very brief period of time before the teacher comes out, maybe to have a chat in private, that's fine, but for a whole lesson, that's not fine. Would you like it if you did something wrong and you're, well, depending on where your role, if you're a head teacher, the director, but if you're a class teacher, the head teacher came in and shouted at you in the staff room, all of these sort of things. So it's about thinking about it and not having that opportunity to explain and to quietly apologise if you have done something wrong. So again, it is a provocation. You could add your own if you wanted to. You can make up your own that might be more suited to your particular context, but they are something to reflect on. Okay. Hopefully I haven't shocked everybody too much with that. So if anybody wants to just pop in the chat or raise your hand when we are nearly done, but it would be good to, we haven't really got time to put you in breakout spaces, and there's rather a lot of you. So anybody just want to say what rights have been infringed? If one particular example that you would like to choose from the scenarios or from the Imagine If provocation, if there's anything you would like to talk about, anybody wants to make a comment? As I've said, you will get PDF of this, so you can take time to reflect and talk to colleagues if that would be helpful. Okay, we've got that right to dignity. Yeah, that's been an issue throughout most of these scenarios and also in the provocation. Not that I'm saying school bells are an infringement of dignity, other than if the child finds them distressing and then they are put in an embarrassing situation. Yeah, relax and play, best art. Okay. And you can start seeing how, if you look at these two children's rights, you can start to see perhaps we could do that in a different way. But again, you'll get all of this information through CAT, so you can go and start to think a bit more about how you would have handled those situations differently. So for you, your challenge is to think about, what do we keep, what do we lose, what do we introduce? So some of the things that are already happening will be very rights-based. You'll be using resources and approaches that absolutely uphold children's rights, and you will be wanting to keep those. There'll be some things you might think, why are we even doing that? It doesn't benefit anybody. It's not helpful. It's just something we've always done. And so we've stopped doing that. And then what do you want to introduce? And that's the bit where you start to plan and you work with your learners to plan the way forward and think about what what would be a better way to do things. And obviously you would also want to include parents, staff, community in moving forward with your rights-based journey. So just again, a final couple of slides. How do you already support the delivery of the goals of education within your school or your setting or your local authority? What professional learning do you provide? So obviously I'm here today, but I know that Kat has already mentioned the circle training, and there'll be lots of other training as well that is available to you. I haven't mentioned much about DYW today, but that whole learner pathway is very much around Article 29 and making sure that children and young people have the right opportunity from 3 to 18 and beyond to follow a pathway that helps them to develop their personality, talents and abilities to the full into a positive destination. Transitions are really, really important as part of that learner's journey. And by transition, I'm not just talking nursery to P1, P7 to S1, post 16. For some children, going to school is a transition, going from one class to another is a transition, going at the dinner hall is a transition. That for most of them, it's automatic. It doesn't cause any concern, but for some, it needs to be planned very carefully. And then what more do you need to do as an establishment, as a local authority, to support the rights of all children? So finally, some implementation considerations in your setting. So just some self-reflection questions. Is it a clear improvement priority? What is your starting point? How do you know? So where are you getting your evidence from? Do you already have a rights-based ethos? Who's going to lead the rights agenda with staff? You really absolutely do have to have the leadership of your establishment supporting it, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have to lead it. But you also have to make sure the learners are involved in leading that agenda, whether it's primary, secondary, community learning. In early learning, obviously that it's done in a different way, but they can still take on some leadership. Learning about rights, when, how. It shouldn't just be an assembly once a month, for example. What support and resources are available? What is feasible? And one of the things I would like to emphasise is that children's rights are not separate. They're not separate from learning for sustainability. They're not separate from inclusion or equalities or DYW or creativity. They're all part of the same thing about meeting the needs of learners. How will you know when you've got better, and how will you recognise that good practice? So there's just a few questions that you can reflect on. I do have some links to early years materials as well, which I can send on to Kat afterwards. Particularly Children's Parliament have got some very good materials that you can use. So I'll send those on as well. Okay, any questions? Kat, I think you did put your link in to the evaluation in the chat, but you might want to put it in again because it's disappeared.
I'll put it in. Yep, I'm just actually looking up the next one. There are lots and lots of training sessions coming up. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop recording. And then